Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really enjoying the ANC's national conference at the moment. And the reason for that is because it is exposing the ANC for exactly who they are. And it's pretty much right there for all of us to see. Now, before I get on to the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. It really does help. Now, you will know, if you watched some of my videos last week, that Cyril is having this national conference where they're talking about how the ANC hopes to arrest this decline. Now, as part of this entire thing, everybody in the ANC, all the leadership have stood up and talked about the renewal of the ANC and how the renewal will fix things. And at that conference, Ramaphosa reaffirmed two things. The first was his commitment to the NHI implementation, and the second was that there was no retreat on BEE. And we're going to get to both of these in a minute. All this whilst ANC leaders were caught in a hawk's extortion sting during the very same conference, allegedly demanding a 300,000 rand bribe to secure a contractor panel access. Now, arrests happened all whilst Cyril Ramaphosa stood preaching about zero tolerance for corruption. And herein is the credibility gap. We've got this whole anti-corruption rhetoric, which Ramaphosa continues to say. He said it for his entire term. And at the very same time that he's preaching about renewal, the elimination of corruption scandals are occurring in real time with his party members under his watch. So let's look at some of the harebrained ideas that Ramaphosa's had during his reformist agenda. Let us not forget that when Ramaphosa came to power, he promised that we would have a new era of accountability. Now remember, he's well into his second term. Now at the ANC NGC, this conference, they demanded the release of the cabinet performance contracts. That's the KPIs that Ramaphosa said that he was going to introduce in 2017. 2017, it's 2025. That's nearly 10 years ago. Now, you will recall that when Ramaphosa first came into power, he said that he would introduce these performance agreements with the ministers. And he repeated the promise repeatedly in public, but he's never released them. Now, insiders are saying that without transparency, renewal claims are meaningless. How can you say to the public that I would have these KPIs, I would judge them based on KPIs, but you never actually release them? You've never even seen whether they've been done. You're claiming you have public accountability, but you can't have public accountability without KPIs. That's why you said you were going to implement them. 7 years later, no KPIs. So we still see that there is weak executive oversight, even under the reformist leadership of the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa, who continues to bang on at his NGC, his conference, about renewal and transformation and oversight and all the wonderful things he's been talking about for 7 years. The guy's a freaking liar. Now let's move on to the next thing he had to say. And this, again, you couldn't make this up. It all seemed to happen at the same time. Because at the ANC NGC, Ramaphosa says we want more BEE, not less, and that a policy review would be suggested, and it would be done on the basis of the acceleration of BEE, not reform or replacement of it. Now, you may look at that and say, well, why is it that the ANC is suddenly looking at this and saying, well, they want to accelerate BEE? It's the BEE Commission, because the BEE Commission reported that there is a decline in deal flow and compliance with deals. Now, the reason there's a decline in deal flow is because nobody's investing in BEE schemes because they've seen that they're scams, and that whenever you invest in a BEE scheme, it ultimately lands up in bankruptcy and money lost. And of course, the whole compliance around it is that those who are investing usually use some kind of fronting arrangement, and they do that so they can get the deal off the ground without sinking their company. Now, all this is occurring at the same time in that a brand new study has just come out and asked a very wide variety of individuals. This isn't just white people. I mean, white people account for like 7%, 6% of the population. So this is a wide appealing report. And in the report, it showed that 54% of those surveyed wanted BEE phased out. 76% in the report said they support merit-based hiring. 67% believe that racial classifications, just by calling you and me black and white, caused more harm than good. All this whilst the DA pushed an economic inclusion bill, which was focused on poverty rather than race. It was the DA's attempt to get rid of BEE. And what was Ramaphosa's famous statement? The ANC is doubling down on the race-based policies as its own voters increased to reject it. So this is reform, is it? Just doing what you've already done, which caused forms of shrinkages in the economy because of corruption. Don't worry, you're going to stamp out corruption whilst corruption is occurring, whilst you give that very speech. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not democracy. This is not democracy. 54% of people surveyed don't want BEE, but the ANC, a 40% party, wants BEE because it enriches ANC cadres. This is not democracy. The ANC doesn't understand what democracy is. It understands that it wants to follow its rules. And if you're not following its rules, it's a problem. Now, amusingly, because of the ANC's anti-minorities rhetoric, support from the minorities have shrunk, and the ANC admits its non-racial character is thinning. Because if you know anything about the ANC, it says that it's a non-sexist, a non-racist, democratic, blah, 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 whatever rubbish. It's a slogan. Internal reports are showing inside the ANC that they are getting a declining support amongst minority communities and middle class, which includes black middle class and affluent voters. And the reason for that is because the ANC is attempting to use the middle class to fund its harebrained ideas to pay for the poorest in the economy. Now, they propose to fix this by including, are you waiting for it? Racial quotas in minority-dense areas. So they're going to say in minority-dense areas, they will mandate that you have the token white guy. You see, this becomes interesting because where's the token white guy in the areas where there aren't minorities? Because in those businesses, if you're a white business owner and you don't have many whites in that area, they're going to mandate that you apply BE to your workforce, but they're not prepared to do it for their own candidates. It's almost like this rule only applies one way. Now, the National Minorities Desk, yes, they're actually calling it the National Minorities Desk, is going to be in charge of ensuring that the relevant bean countering is occurring. Because, let's be honest, everything the ANC does is around bean countering. Now, the ANC's strategy to losing its minorities is, well, more racial engineering, not less. It's almost like they don't understand that they've lost support from minorities because of racial engineering. And the ANC thinks we're going to reform this. We're going to have more of what we always did that caused the problems that we currently have. This is stupid. The ANC is retarded. The ANC cannot have structural reform. It can't, because it can't move beyond identity politics. It can't move beyond the same rubbish it's always done. The reason that the ANC is in the mess they are, according to them, is that, well, they just didn't do those policies hard enough. And if they just do it harder, just call me harder, comrade, it will all be great. This is dumb. This is the stupidest logic I've ever come across in my life. But what do I expect from the ANC? But what it really shows you is that Cyril Ramaphosa really doesn't have any credibility left. You can sit there and preach reform whilst people are committing corruption. We're going to have more BEE because we are a democratic state and it's the will of the democracy. The democracy don't want this. But don't worry, you're going to do it anyway. This is not democracy. The guy's a joke. Who the hell is voting for these clowns? Now, in other news, let's talk about the other clown, and that's Julius Malema, who continues to label Trump a modern-day Hitler. I mean, this is the pot calling the kettle, I'm not allowed to say it because it would be racist. In any case, he called for boycotts of the G20 summit in 2026 in Miami if South Africa is excluded, because South Africa is supposedly that important, even though no one cares that South Africa is not going. Now, he framed the US hostility against South Africa as punishment for BRICS alignment and its anti-Israel positioning. Well, yes, that's true, because the US has specifically said that they are annoyed with South Africa because South Africa is friends with all of its enemies. Ergo, you're our enemy too, because you frequently side with all the countries we consider to be detrimental to the US interests. This isn't hard to understand. But you see, South Africa is stupid because it seems to think that it's AfriForum and solidarity. Yeah, it's them and their lies. Even though the US has said specifically on camera, they are punishing South Africa because of the company we keep. Now, interestingly enough, I did a video on Sunday around the Xhosa king who went to Israel. And I did say in that video, it's going to be so interesting to see what Juju does against the king, because he went there and said, well, he actually sides with Israel. And this was completely contrary to Julius's position. Because unfortunately, Julius was raised in the ANC, which means that he has that whole free Palestine indoctrination from birth. I mean, he just had it from birth. So, yeah, he's now kicked the king out of his party. Yep, he says that the party won't tolerate anybody who sides with Israel. It's nice to see that the party has lots of differing opinions in the party. You know, they're not all NPCs saying the exact same thing. Yes, that's Julius's party. NPCs. In any case, actually looking at the G20 and specifically the US and the way it's treating South Africa, let's end on that. Because as you know, underneath the Trump-Rubio administration, they've excluded South Africa from the G20. Now, South Africa, as you know, is a founding G20 member, not been invited or accredited, and basically it's not going. One of the reasons cited is because of our financial track record. Obviously, Donald Trump said, nothing's really happened with his economy. It hasn't really grown. It shouldn't really be in the G20 anymore because it's just not a serious economy. Now, that means that government has responded, saying, first, the Minister of the Presidency says that they're not in the business of pleading with the US to be included. Yes, that's because the US isn't going to listen to you anyway. But they insist that they remain committed to the G20 principles and will not beg for inclusion. I don't know what those G20 principles are, apart from commie claptrap and green agenda, give us free money. But Dangle, that's the interesting one. Dangle, Islamist Dangle, the guy who's ruined Durko. Well, he says that South Africa will not gate crash meetings. But you couldn't gate crash this meeting if you wanted to. They need to give you a visa to go there, and they're just going to tell you to voetsek when you ask for a visa. Are you going to get into the US without a visa? But inevitably, he says that they won't accept exclusion as being legitimate. Well, I don't really know what you're going to do about it, because you can't force them to grant you a visa. Now, he warns that sidelining South Africa risks turning the G20 into gatherings of some countries, and that will undermine its legitimacy. But you didn't think it was undermining the legitimacy when the US didn't come to the G20 in South Africa. See how this always occurs. It's always rules for me, rules for thee, completely different rules. And he argues that no G20 president has unilateral power to exclude a member. They don't. They can exclude you from their state. I don't understand why these people just don't understand this. So diplomats say that other G20s are quietly warning the US that sidelining South Africa damages the multilateral credibility, which, to be frank, is exactly what Trump is trying to do. He doesn't want all these commie morons telling his country what to do. Now, as you'll know, South Africa says they actually want to include Poland as the replacement for South Africa. But the news is, and I can't verify this, but apparently Poland says that it wants G20 membership, but not at South Africa's expense. And it confirms that it was invited by the US as a guest earlier this week. Now, Dangle further went on to suggest that South Africa is only being excluded because it successfully pushed a leader's declaration in South Africa whilst the US disengaged. So apparently, yeah, it's because we ran the successful G20 and now the US is jowl. Yep, proper jowl. This is the brilliant genius of the logic of government officials. Now, they say the test is whether the G20 is rule-based or US-dominated. Well, let me tell you, when it's in the US, it's US-dominated because they're the host country. Just like when it was in South Africa, it was South Africa-dominated because we invited the G100 and everybody else said, not really sure that's a good idea, including the US. But you said, it's our rules, it's our country, we do what we want. See how this works? Well, not to these idiots. So the upshot of all this is that South Africa is being diplomatically isolated from the G20, but they say they won't capitulate and beg for inclusion. Yeah, that's probably because they're not going to include you anyway. Now, turning then on to the very final news story, and this is AGOA, and that's apparently South Africa may be included because the US committee has approved a 3-year AGOA extension. And this was by a 37-3 vote, the 3 against 37-4. And actually, surprisingly, South Africa hasn't actually been explicitly excluded yet from that. But there's still vulnerability to political retaliation. So it will be interesting to see whether or not they actually go out of their way to remove South Africa from AGOA. Now, it's important to recognize for all the commie idiots that just go, wow, who needs the US? We don't need the US. They can all footack. Yeah, this is the 30% IQ we have in South Africa because, you see, South Africa actually maintained a trade surplus in 2025, helped by EU demand and high gold prices, which means that the US buys more from us than we buy from it. It means money comes into South Africa, not money going out. We have a trade deficit with China. That means our money goes to China and we get their cheap rubbish. See how this works? That impoverishes a nation, the US enriches a nation. But I couldn't expect the 30% to note it because they'll just be like, I hate Trump because reasons. News 24 told me I should. And talking of News 24, isn't it interesting? News 24, the impartial news outlet that, isn't bought and paid for, did something that we all expected it to do. It actually wrote an entire hit piece against Donald Trump, to show that Donald Trump is in the wrong, South Africa's in the right. Not sponsored by the ANC at all. At least that's their suggestion, and I'm not sure I buy that. You can let me know what you think of that in the comments section below. Anyway, that's the news stories of today. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and until tomorrow, bye.